Thank you very much, Dick. I think this was in the grape shot, but looking ahead towards the fall, our speakers in September through December, we're going to have Scott Mingus with us. He's a retired chemist, lives in York, Pennsylvania. He's going to talk on the Second Battle of Winchester. And then in October, Ethan Rafuse, who teaches at the Army Command and General Staff College in Kansas, is going to come down and tell us about that general who was a legend in his own mind, the young Napoleon. Howard Strauss is an old friend of the Roundtable. He'll be with us in November to talk about the Trent affair. And then in December, I'm really pleased that we could have Jeff Hunt come over from Texas. He's in the museum business over there, and he's written several books that deal with the Civil War right after the Battle of Gettysburg up through the Mine Run campaign in 1863. And he's going to talk about Lee and Meade after Gettysburg. So those will be our speakers in the fall. But tonight, however, it's appropriate that we have a Stonewall Jackson talk since we just passed the anniversary. And like General Jackson, the last meeting between Lee and the mighty Stonewall remains somewhat shrouded in mystery. For most of us, the last encounter between Lee and Jackson reminds us of the famous painting known by its title, The Last Meeting of Lee and Jackson, by the artist Everett Giulio in 1869. The artist has Jackson, however, astride a giant steed resembling American Pharaoh and not Little Sorrel. Furthermore, Stonewall is sporting a red cape, reminiscent of Caesar commanding the 10th Legion, rather than having him wear that famous black raincoat that we all know he sported on May 2nd. And finally, the mountains behind the two heroes of Chancellorsville rise in the background like Everest, rather than nearby Clark Mountain, a Confederate signal station. Giulio's painting is a constant reminder that while we know a few things about the famous last meeting of the two great Confederate chieftains, there are unanswered questions. We know that they met in the northwest quadrant of the intersection of the old plank road and the road leading to Catherine Furnace. We know that after studying their tactical options, Lee and Jackson developed this unbelievable, bold idea of sending 28,000 Confederates off into the wilderness to strike old Joe Hooker's 11th Corps, holding the right flank under old prayer book, Uh-oh, Howard. Historians generally agree, too, that it was Lee who suggested the tactical flank march, but it was Jackson who planned the route of march and executed the assault late in the afternoon of May 2nd. But as my friend Bob Crick would often tell tour groups, there was much we don't know about the logistics of this extraordinary military operation. So this evening, we might gain some insight into the mysteries surrounding Jackson's unparalleled flank march. Beth Parnicza is an interpretive ranger with the National Park Service, currently posted at Appomattox Courthouse. She previously worked at Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania National Military Park, where she led tours of the Chancellorsville battlefield for visitors. Tonight, she's going to share with us her research and her interpretations regarding Jackson's last map, which might hold the key to unlocking some of the mysteries surrounding the mighty Stonewall at Chancellorsville. So please welcome Beth Parnicza.
Okay, the first question is one of the most important. Can everybody hear me? You in the back, y'all, you're good? All right, fantastic. Okay, great. Well, first I'd like to say thank you all so much for having me here today. This is my first time speaking to a group since COVID, and let me tell you, it is a complete delight. I'm realizing how much I've missed this over the past 2 years, and I appreciate the treat. So thank you all so much. I'd also like to extend my thanks. This is one of those obscure research topics that required an awful lot of help, not just days in the archives, but in fact, people making special accommodations for me. So I'd like to give a special shout out to Kathy Wright at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, and Virginia Dunn from the Library of Virginia, and many colleagues who helped to nudge me in the right direction while I was trying to figure out one of these mysteries of Chancellorsville. So I'm going to start off with a couple questions. Wanting to know who here has been to Chancellorsville Battlefield before? It's really impressive for Arizona. Y'all get around. That's great. I was a little afraid that there might not be so many hands. Who here would consider yourself to be an admirer of Stonewall Jackson? Okay. Just about as many hands as went to Chancellorsville. Understandable, that might go together. So what we're going to start out with tonight, our main goal here is to be basically interrogating and exploring one key artifact that's in the holdings of Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And it is a map that Jackson drew of the Chancellorsville battlefield. So we're going to talk a little bit about the context around that map, but very much digging into why did Jackson draw this map? What did it tell him? What was it used for during the Battle of Chancellorsville? So one of the things that we thought we knew a lot about, and then once we started to really dig into, we realized we didn't know very much at all. Which, as you all know, if you've done your own research, that's really the fun part, is when you start to realize that you actually have no idea what you're looking at. So bear with me as we begin our exploration, but we're going to start with this very much beloved story of the Cracker Box meeting. Yes, so we have this, and there are many depictions of the last kind of conference between Lee and Jackson. So as such mythified creatures as Lee and Jackson, all of their last moments together are chronicled in different ways. This is their last meeting, but not the last time they saw each other. If you know anything about the Battle of Chancellorsville, you know about Stonewall Jackson's famous flank march, especially if you were here before and listening to my colleague Frank talking about how absurd it is to split your forces in the face of a larger foe. You think about the brilliance that Lee and Jackson demonstrated in coming up with this movement. This is one of the main focuses of your Battle of Chancellorsville understanding. But it's interestingly enough, we're going to have to back up before this. But this scene is showing, Lee and Jackson seated on, as one account called them, Yankee cracker boxes that had been left over by the Union Army. While they're talking and discussing, this is the evening of May 1st, so the first initial contact between the armies has just occurred. Joseph Hooker has also split his forces, so the Union command has left some men in Fredericksburg, some men have gone out in a big sweeping flank movement around to the west to try to come in behind Lee and catch him by surprise. Lee has divided his forces in turn, left some in Fredericksburg and sent the rest out to meet this threat. So we see the Battle of Chancellorsville developing as those two forces that have been sent west collide. And on May 1st, the Confederates begin with an attack that was somewhat unexpected for Joe Hooker's men. He decides to pull back and take up a defensive position. Historians will argue for the rest of time whether that was a good decision or not. See me afterwards, one of my favorite arguments. But for now, we're going to focus on that evening of May 1st. So we've had initial contact. The Union forces have pulled themselves back into a defensive position, and Lee and Jackson meet to decide what they're going to do the next day. Keep in mind, they're dramatically outnumbered here. Lee is outnumbered 2-1 during the Battle of Chancellorsville. He's got about 63,000 men, and Joseph Hooker has about 120,000 men for the battle. So it's interesting in itself that these two are sitting down to decide of what they want to do for the next day. But here we are. They're sitting on these cracker boxes and talking about what their options are. In another famous moment of this scene, Jeb Stuart rides in with news that he's been scouting along the Union lines, and between Stuart's probes as well as some probing attacks that the Confederates have launched during the day, they found that the Union Army is pretty strong just about everywhere except its far right flank, which is, in military terms, it's in the air. It isn't bent back to meet any kind of threats. It's not anchored on any kind of defensive position. So it's vulnerable. And that's the news that Stewart is bringing to Lee and Jackson. And so that night, they're having this conversation. And here is at least one portion of that conversation in which Lee begins and says, "What do you propose to do?" And Jackson says, "Go around here." And he's showing whether on a map or broom straw or just the ground itself. Historians will be debating for some time again, but he says, "Go around here." And then Lee says, "What do you propose to make this movement with?" And Jackson says, "With my whole corps." And that's really the part that is most noteworthy, because it means that he is leaving 14,000 men to look directly in the eyes of Joseph Hooker's about 75,000 men out here in the western portions. And he's taking the bulk of the forces on flank movement around the Union Army. It's a pivoting point for the battle. It catches Hooker off guard. For those of you familiar with the battle, you know it changes the entire axis of fighting for the Battle of Chancellorsville. Many folks don't even know that there's fighting on May 3rd, even though it is also a critical day of fighting, because both this meeting, Jackson's flank attack, looms so large in our collective memory of the Civil War that we have focused very much on this story. And our artifact has long been, that we're exploring today, has long been associated with this. A news story that first announced its appearance in the world came about June of 1932, where a newspaper article first mentioned the donation of a copy of this map to the forming Battlefield Park. And it says, "This sketch is believed to have been made by Jackson while explaining to General Lee at the bivouac stone the route he proposed to take in carrying out Lee's order to turn Hooker's right flank in the Battle of Chancellorsville." So here, the first time that we're talking about this artifact, we're seeing it associated with this meeting. But if we take a look at the map, we'll find that there's some things missing, which is what starts our quest. You'll notice that the vulnerable right flank does not show up on this map. None of the roads that Jackson took show up on this map. And much of the Union position is also not marked on this map. It was displayed at the park, at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, in the Chancellorsville Battlefield Visitor Center for at least 40 years, however, with this association, before it was removed from display because folks were concerned about light damage. It's a very delicate piece of paper. But the park then went to display it again, to put it on special display for the 150th anniversary in 2013. And that's what started us down this trail, because I was tasked to write some text for it. So I said, well, let's take a closer look at this map and see what it's telling us. And maybe we can line it up with a modern map and see exactly where this takes us. But again, more questions than answers. And it showed me in particular how often when we look at artifacts, we read the story a little bit backwards. We don't start with, what does this tell us? We start with, what do I know about this subject? And read it backwards. So we're going to instead start with what we know, start with what the artifact is telling us, and then try to build out from there. So what is the artifact that we're looking at? This is, so I've mentioned the map already, but the map itself is pasted in Robert E. Lee's copy of the first biography of Stonewall Jackson. It's the first copy off the press, and it's The Life of Stonewall Jackson from Official Papers, Contemporary Narratives and Personal Acquaintance by John Eston Cook. I actually honestly haven't read it, but I've heard it's not a great book. So not to disappoint anybody, but it was published in 1866. So I think the author was most likely trying to capitalize on the popularity of Stonewall Jackson as quickly as he possibly could. But the first copy off the press goes to Robert E. Lee. And so you see it signed here. This volume was the first from the press by the printers, Richmond, 1863. And you see Robert E. Lee's signature as well, because this was his personal copy and this was presented to him. He then also pastes this map as well as a sample of Jackson's signature into his copy. So you see that this is not just, this is an artifact with many layers. It's a biography, but it's also a personal copy belonging to Lee. And it is also a memento that Lee has made to Stonewall Jackson. But today we're going to focus mostly on that map. So let's take a look at the map. So this is the hand-drawn map that Stonewall Jackson made of the Chancellorsville battlefield. And so when we start to look at it, we've got a couple different things that we want to ask ourselves. So firstly, the first question I asked is, what does this map tell us about Stonewall Jackson himself? So take a look at it. This is all in his writing, and you see his initials off to the bottom corner here. The first thing that really stood out to me was how well this is done to scale. We'll do an overlay in a few moments. I do have a modern map overlay to show you how well it's done to scale, but it speaks a lot to Jackson's attention to detail, as well as his use of his engineering education. This is a West Point graduate we're talking about, of course, and also to some degree his familiarity with the ground, the landscape itself. So there have been Confederate pickets on duty in this region all winter long, from 1862 into the spring of 1863, and Jackson himself came through this area, through Chancellorsville, on his way to Fredericksburg in November of 1862, on his way to participate in the Battle of Fredericksburg. So this is somewhat familiar ground, but it isn't completely familiar ground for these folks. But for Jackson, it's enough that he's able to draw this map, again, remarkably to scale. It's drawn, as far as we can tell, and I've done a lot of those little comparisons of like, well, he does his R's like this. Does it match these R's over here? And I think as best I can tell, it does. So we see that Jackson has excellent map makers on hand, Jeff Hotchkiss, Keith Boswell, but he is still doing some things himself. So he is self-sufficient when he needs to be, and we'll delve into those map makers and what they're doing and why exactly Jackson is stuck making his own map for this. But for now, we'll say he's very self-sufficient. And in a fun turn of events, this is also likely from the same notepad that contained the paper for his last dispatch that he sends to Lee just before he starts his flank attack. It's the same size, same paper and pencil look. And here it is. So you can see pretty similar. And again, I was also using some of this for looking at the handwriting. Other things. As we noticed when we look at the map again, we will, actually, let's go ahead on to the map. So this is the map with the modern overlay on it. And as you take a look, keep in mind, keep looking at the pencil marks for now in the background. You can see the ways that Stonewall Jackson actually interacted with the map. So one of the things that we're always looking for with artifacts is, did someone just draw this and leave it, or did they actually use it? And looking at this map, we can see particularly, here we are. Particularly like here, where it says tabernacle, you've got little X's, you've got some squiggly lines. So this is something that Jackson interacted with. I mean, he was jabbing, making pencil marks on this. So this was something that he used either in a conversation with someone else or as he was personally strategizing on things, which is really interesting. And he has different marks at different points. So then you start to ask yourself, well, was there any kind of rhyme or reason to the markings that he's using? So we'll start to delve into those next, which is, what does the map contain and what can the map tell us? So some of our key points, so we're looking east to west here, west to east. Directions are important. Here where it says tavern, you see it lining up pretty well with the Wilderness Tavern. This is our westernmost landmark here. And then we also see Chancellorsville. These are the things that are labeled. Chancellorsville, that's sort of central mark. We see Tabernacle, marking out Tabernacle Church, which for those of you familiar with the Battle of Chancellorsville, this is not a very major landmark, but it could have been. And that's part of why Jackson has it on his map here, I believe. And we also see Hamilton, marking Hamilton's Crossing, which is also down here to the south. This had played more of a role in the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862, but it's also where Union forces had crossed on April 29th as kind of a diversionary effort during the Battle of Chancellorsville. You also see Fredericksburg itself marked with this sort of filled in space here. You see RR labeling the Rappahannock River up here, Rappahannock River. Again, that's where we sort of diverge from being super accurate, but it's there. The Brock Road, which is the main north-south road in the area here. See, it has a squiggle line on it, just like the Rappahannock River has a squiggle line on it. We've got some other important roads that you see. You've got the road north from Chancellorsville that takes you up to Ely's Ford. You've also got US Ford, marked. It's a little bit off. I think this is US 4 because it's after the convergence of these two rivers, the Rappahannock and the Rapidan. So it's right here, as it is right here on our modern map. And then we see, and then of course we see our main east-west roads between Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road, which end up becoming pretty critical during the battle itself. And then we see different markings as well. We see a marking at, I just realized some of you may not have heard all of that. So we also see some markings at US Ford. We see two big X's. We see down here at Hamilton also two big X's. These are places that may be of interest, both in terms of this is where we know federal troops have crossed, and this may be one of their targets. We also see smaller X's here at Tabernacle Church and what we presume to be, or I presume to be, Zoan Church. Both of these are locations for Confederate troops. On April 30th, as the battle begins. We'll talk more about this as we continue along. And then again, like I said, Hamilton's Crossing down here as well. So then we start to ask, well, what can this tell us about the battle of Chancellorsville itself? Because that's really what we're here to understand, right? Is how did Jackson use this map or not use this map in the Battle of Chancellorsville, and why does that matter? So my first question then was to ask, well, what maps did Jackson have access to? What maps did the Confederates use? There we go. Did I mention I haven't done this in a couple of years? Thanks for bearing with me. So what maps did the Confederates have to use as the battle started to develop? We know the Confederates are on their home turf and have been patrolling all winter, but I can tell you that as an agent of the federal government, I totally sympathize with the Confederate forces here, that they had spent much of their winter catching up on their paperwork from this campaign season of the year before. Again, nothing but sympathy. So even though they've been here and have traveled this route and have been here all winter long, the map makers have largely been making maps to accompany Jackson's reports that he is also trying to catch up on throughout the winter, which means that they haven't necessarily been thinking ahead of what might I need for the spring campaign season until about April. So I started to dig into, particularly Jed Hotchkiss, one of Jackson's map makers, kept a very detailed diary of what he was working on. It's extremely helpful. And I can tell you, as I'm looking for anything, again, that is not catching up on his paperwork from before, but is actually looking ahead, we don't get that really until about April 17th of 1863. So the campaign season is pretty much upon them by the time Jackson is saying, oh, wait a minute, we might need some help with this. So Jed Hotchkiss had made a reduction map of Spotsylvania. He'd made maps of the Fredericksburg battlefield, Culpeper, Caroline County, but hadn't yet gotten himself all the way to Spotsylvania by that point. And that is to say, he has done all of Spotsylvania on that day, April 17th. So up to that point, he'd been working on those other maps. Now he's getting Spotsylvania itself, Spotsylvania County, which is where this battle will take place. So, however, once this campaign gets underway, I think Jackson realizes that a map of the entire county is really not particularly helpful when you're looking at very detailed spaces and exactly where he can maneuver his men through. So he realizes he needs more maps. Yes, okay. Also, so we have Jed Hotchkiss, we have another map maker on hand, and that is Keith Boswell. Boswell's also working for Jackson in terms of drawing maps. Boswell had made a little bit more progress in terms of things that would be helpful to Jackson. Boswell had mapped Banks Ford and United States Ford in April. Again, though, keep in mind, it's April, like the campaign is about to develop. This campaign kicks off in terms of infantry movements, April 29th, or April 27th, really, is when the Union forces begin to leave their camps. So, putting it off for the last minute. But Boswell has mapped Banks Ford and US Ford, which, again, you probably saw US Ford on the map there. Both of these fords are going to play a role in the battle to come. And he has an undated last sketch of Chancellor's, which is focused on an area either south of the house, south of the Chancellorsville house itself, or more likely not the Chancellorsville house itself, but a house belonging to another branch of the Chancellor family further west. So really not helpful to Jackson's purposes at all. Oh, sorry. So that's Banks Ford. We did US Ford, Banks Ford. And then this is the sketch of the Chancellor house itself. I should note, for those of you not familiar with Keith Boswell's story, the reason that all of his maps have a massive hole in the center of them is that he had his sketchbook in his chest pocket when he rode out with Stonewall Jackson, head of the troops, on the evening of May 2nd, and Keith Boswell unfortunately was shot and killed that evening. So we can't tell you exactly what he was sketching because most of his map, particularly this one that says Chancellors on it, is severely damaged. But bringing this back to the Battle of Chancellorsville. So these are the maps that we have on hand as the campaign develops. How helpful do you think those maps are? We've got maps of 2 fords and a full county map. It's going to be a struggle for Jackson to lead his campaign based on those maps alone. So as the campaign begins to develop, and you can see here, this is the evening of April 29th. So like I said, Booker's troops will set off on their march April 27th, and they're swinging across. So again, we'll take a look at our fords. Here, we've got US Ford that you saw on the other map. So the Union forces, by the way, have been coming up and around over here. You see US Ford here, you see Ely's Ford, you see Germanna Ford, Kelly's Ford. These are all the important major fords that the armies were using. Banks Ford that we mentioned before is down here. Actually doesn't play too prominent of a role, but it could. So we see that, you know, Jackson had his eye on these river crossings. That's why he's asked Boswell to make these sketches. But what he's going to need to know next, now that he realizes that this is the region that the Union forces are coming through, is how to get to them. All of the space in between that he doesn't have a map of, or that he only has a very broad view map of. You can also see down here, those markings near Hamilton's Crossing that showed up on Jackson's map. That's these folks down here. That's sort of the diversionary Union forces that cross the river. That's these 2 blocks right here to engage some left behind Confederate forces. But you can see here, Confederate forces retreating back from those fords. This is just a very small force that's going to start coming back, retreating back toward the main body of Confederate forces. And it's April 29th, it's this evening, that Robert E. Lee realizes, as he gets word from these pickets, that this is the main force of Joseph Hooker's attack and that he needs to respond to this movement. So on April 30th, Jackson dispatches Jeff Hotchkiss to make maps of the area. Again, making every procrastinator ever feel pretty good about their life decisions because they've been sitting in this land all winter long, and it's April 30th as the campaign begins that we finally get Hotchkiss starting to make maps. But Hotchkiss is just starting on April 30th. Jackson's not going to have a map in hand as this campaign begins. So things get a little bit challenging for Jackson. As Hotchkiss says, so not only is Hotchkiss directed to make maps, but he's directed to make 8 maps. So he says the general sent for me in the PM. So in the afternoon, even of April 30th, the general sent for me in the PM, and I rode down to the front where he directed me to, quote, strike off 8 maps, embracing the region between the Rapidan River and the Rappahannock, more northern branch. The Rapidan and the Rappahannock, and reaching back to the Virginia Central Railroad, and one for himself extending to Stevensburg, which means that Jackson, even still, is not sure where this campaign or where this battle is going to take place because he's looking at things potentially all the way further west off the edge of the map here towards Culpeper. So even Jackson, even on April 30th, doesn't quite know where this battle is going to take place. Hotchkiss is now given a massive amount of territory to cover to try to make these 8 maps. But he starts to make a move to do so. And that same night, Jackson is going to start. So Jackson, you see, is seeking information everywhere that he can get it. So that same night, he's going to ask this chaplain, Beverly Tucker Lacy, for feasible routes between Fredericksburg, over here, and Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville, by the way, for those of you who haven't been, it's not really a town. It's just a large house at a crossroads. It's kind of pretentiously named. For those of you who've been there, you've probably seen the footprint and would remember. But it's not a large town like Fredericksburg was. But Jackson's asking Beverly Tucker Lacy these questions because Lacy is a local boy, somewhat local. His brother lives, he's lived in Fredericksburg, and his brother lives just out to the west. So he asks Lacy for some feasible routes between Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. And then as Lacy recounted, Jackson, then asked him, Lacy, if they knew the roads towards Chancellorsville. Lacy described those roads. He asked, could you guide a column there in daylight, or could you get me guides? Lacy suggested young Yerby, young man in the area. But when they got to Yerby's, the family were in bed, and Jackson would not allow them to be waked. As they walked back, Jackson stated that the enemy was in force at Chancellorsville, that General Anderson was up there at Tabernacle Church, about 3 miles in front of the enemy. So Beverly Tucker Lacy, the chaplain, also now trying to help Jackson figure out where the enemy could be and how to arrange his troops and how to respond. So this is Jackson now quickly trying to put the pieces together as best he can. Again, Lacy, who was a chaplain, had been a pastor in Fredericksburg as recently as 1862. Lacy suggests that they march overnight to respond to this threat coming in from the west. Jackson agrees. He gets his army in place and marching by about 3 a.m. So now he's kicking things into gear and looking to respond to the Union threat coming in from the west. Now, as Lacy and Jackson are talking, there's no map that's mentioned. But I think part of what's interesting is that the map that we've been looking at, Jackson's last hand-drawn map, lays out this situation pretty clearly. So we see here in this map, we see the river crossings, we see Chancellorsville prominent on this map. We see Tabernacle and Zoan churches being prominent spots. And so perhaps the map began to come into play about this time, as Jackson's getting information from Lacy, who is a local, and as he's sending Hotchkiss out to try to do some reconnaissance and draw together a map. Hard to say. I'm going to be saying this a couple times. Perhaps the map dates to this time. So it's up to you all to decide when you think this map was made, what you think it was used for. It's part of the beauty of being a historian is we don't always have to have the answers to some of the time. But meanwhile, Jed Hotchkiss again dispatched. The general sent me at 9 p.m. to look for a feasible route for our troops to Salem Church. So I was riding all night. The moon shone brightly. I found our forces in motion by 3 a.m. So now they're looking at a movement closer to these few churches that are the primary landmarks between Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. So now they're potentially looking at a movement towards Salem Church. By the way, it's right here, kind of in the center between Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. The next day, Friday, May 1st, so we talked about the troops leaving around 3 a.m. So the next day, we have another quote from Jed Hotchkiss. I'm not sure that Jed Hotchkiss slept between April 30th and the afternoon, evening of May 1st. Because by that point, Friday, May 1st, Hotchkiss says, I got back to camp at 4:30 a.m., found all packing up to move. I followed on at a later hour, so maybe you did get a nap, with Brown and overtook the army at Tabernacle Church, then finished maps and supplied the division commanders. The general had left our camp about a half hour before day and reached Tabernacle Church about 8:30 a.m. So, interestingly enough, here we finally have an established timeline of when Jackson and his forces get a map in hand, made by a professional map maker and not made by Stonewall Jackson himself. But what does this tell us again about the map? Did Jackson continue to reference his own map, or did he then immediately switch to the Hotchkiss map that he was provided and that his division commanders had the same version of? We don't know. And again, we'll continue to take a look at this map, and we'll keep coming back to it as the battle progresses to see just what it might have been used for. So the most popular standing theory for the map, of course, had been that it was used to plan or during the day on May for the flank march on May 2nd. So we're going to take a look a little bit at the points of emphasis or focus that evening, on the evening of May 1st, as Lee and Jackson are planning their movement for May 2nd. That cracker box meeting with the two of them sitting around the fire, it's a meeting in some ways that is everybody's worst nightmare, that it starts late in the evening and it just keeps going. And they actually take sort of a nap break in the middle of it, but it's a very long meeting that these two gentlemen are sitting there trying to figure out what to do. And there's a few different staff officers who come in and out of this meeting. Again, not only do Lee and Jackson also take rest during the night, but so do some of those staff officers, which means that some of our accounts are a little bit piecemeal because the staff officers write the most about it. And every so often they're writing, well, and then I laid down to sleep, but then someone else had, perhaps gotten up and listened in. So here are the accounts of the folks who are taking part in this meeting and talking about what maps are being used when and what things are referenced. So we're back to Beverly Tucker Lacy, chaplain, who in many ways as the local, who certainly made many trips between Fredericksburg and his brother's house out to the west on the wilderness battlefield. Lacy is leading the efforts to find the roadways for this flank attack. So Lacy is the first part of this conversation. Jackson is asking particularly what roadways are available for use. So Lee and Jackson already have this plan in mind, that they want to split their forces, that they want to target O.O. Howard out here, this vulnerable right flank of the Union Army. They've already decided this is their goal. So now their question is, how do they get from all the way over here to over here? And that's the goal they're trying to find by talking to staff officers, local guides, the cavalry, anybody that can help. So Jackson asks Beverly Tucker Lacy what roadways might be available for them to use. Lacy answered, yes, there are roadways. There's a blind road leading from the furnace nearly parallel to the plank road, the furnace that they're talking about, by the way, Catherine Furnace right down here. That there was a blind road leading from the furnace nearly parallel to the plank road, which fell into a road running northwards, which would again lead into the plank road above Chancellorsville. Jackson said, as you all might be feeling the same way, take this map and lay it down, because he's trying to see for himself, what does this look like? When Jackson says, take this map, we don't quite know what map it is he's using, except we know that that route was not drawn on his hand-drawn map. So Lacy, lays it out for them. And when Lacy had done so, Jackson said, that is too near. It will go within the line of the enemy's pickets. Do you know no other? And Lacy replied that he presumed the furnace road would intersect the other road leading back above Chancellorsville, but he had never rode it himself. Jackson then said, go with Hotchkiss to the furnace, ascertain whether those roads met and are practicable for artillery, and send Hotchkiss back with the information, and you get me a guide. So all this happening in the middle of the night. They are to find a road further away from the Union picket lines, which are going to be right in through here. They're supposed to find this road that connects the furnace road all the way over here to the Rock Road. They're supposed to tell whether those roads are practical for artillery. Jackson is bringing his entire corps, including the artillery, and to send a guide, and to find a guide and send Hotchkiss back. Lacy gets a local boy named Charles Welford to act as the guide, and Hotchkiss goes back. Hotchkiss in his diary adds a little bit of detail and said Jackson was looking for specifically a road by which we could get around to the turnpike in the vicinity of the Old Wilderness Tavern, which is a major landmark on Jackson's hand-drawn map, under cover of the woods without making the long circuit by way of Todd's Tavern. Todd's Tavern would have been an extra 2 miles or so. Hotchkiss returns, makes his report, spreads out the map he had marked up at Welford's. Apparently the map used as a reference before, so perhaps the same map, if it's coming from Jed Hotchkiss, he's likely using his own map because that'd be the map that makes the most sense to him. And he spreads out the map and then relates this conversation between Lee and Jackson that sets the plan a lot more firmly. So Hotchkiss continues and says the generals were up at an early hour and had a consultation in the pines on the top of the hill where the Catherine Furnace Road turns from the plank road, sitting on Yankee cracker boxes, which the enemy had left there. I went down to Mr. Welford's, where General Stewart had his quarters, and ascertained the roads that led around to the enemy's rear, and came back and reported to Generals Lee and Jackson, who consulted and examined the map, and then started the Second Corps down by the furnace. for its division in front, and went on to the Brock Road, and then up it a piece and into a private road, and so on. So it's really interesting, and part of what I appreciate about Jed Hotchkiss's account here is that unlike everybody else in the world, except for me, who is focused on the meeting between Lee and Jackson and its contents, Jed Hotchkiss is focused on the maps. He wants to remember which maps are being used where, and as a map maker, that is actually what he's paying attention to. So when he talks about laying something out on the map, when he talks about referencing what he's seen on a map with the generals, he is actually paying attention to the maps in a way that almost no other observer actually is. And he actually has a post-war dispute with one of Jackson's other staff officers, James Power Smith, about the maps, because he's just a wonderful person like that. And so they actually start talking about the details, and it leads him to a few different questions. And he says, what I cannot well understand is the statement that a map was consulted, etc., in the night when we had no lights or even a campfire that I can recall. And in the interview in which I was present, Lee did not produce a map, nor did he produce one in the early morning of the 3rd. I used my own map, which I still have at both of these interviews. So for the best of what we know, based on our map maker presence, Jed Hotchkiss says the only map that was there was his map, and he's the one who was using it. And he still has it, by the way. So we know, though, or we believe, what part of the mystique here is that there was a fire, that they were meeting around a fire sitting on those cracker boxes. So Hotchkiss clearly was gone also for long stretches of this meeting. So we can't preclude that Jackson's map was also used at this meeting, perhaps what Hotchkiss had written off with his. So it's not ruling it out, but it is to say that the map mentioned prominently in these accounts was probably Jed Hotchkiss's and not Stonewall Jackson's hand-drawn map. There's another account by Lieutenant William Norman, 2nd North Carolina, who claims that the generals worked with broom straw that they laid out on the ground or on the cracker box. So was it broom straw? Was it a map? Was it both? It's really hard to say. But one of the things, again, that we can go back to in this case is taking a look at Jackson's map itself and noticing that the sheer information that's detailed on that map that Jackson drew in relates much more to the early battle scenarios than it does to what we're talking about here. In terms of Jackson finding the route for his troops to go, in terms of the location of that right flank of the Union forces, and how to get there and how to plan out that attack, which suggests that Jackson either stopped using his map by that point, or it simply wasn't really part of the factor, part of the conversation. We know that this is also not the map. So again, if you're combing through all of your Chancellorsville sources looking for one specific reference to a map, you will find another reference to a map that is sent back to Robert E. Lee, and that is on the afternoon, right as Jackson's troops are poised, as in this map, poised to attack. Jackson sends back a map with that last dispatch that we saw before. That's not this map, however, because Hotchkiss, who was reminded by Beverly Tucker Lacy about this detail, said General Jackson had written a dispatch to General Lee and then requested me to make a map to be sent with that, showing where he was at the time, and that he had left Mr. Lacy with me to be my guide in following him after I had completed the map, which I made on my knee in a fence corner, as I now remember, and given it to the messenger to General Lee. So it wasn't that map either. It really does make you wonder at some point though where all of these maps went to, because what a collection that would be, particularly for all of Hotchkiss's maps, not just his finished products. But bringing us back to the map that we're talking about, back to Jackson's hand-drawn map. Now that we've talked about the maps and the landmarks, and we all want another look, right? So what are some of the strategic points of concern that Jackson is highlighting on this map? We're looking at major strategic points, right? The Rappahannock River, that's a big one. Union Army is going to have to get across it either here at Fredericksburg or here to the west if they're going to get to the Confederate forces. We have another major strategic point, squiggly lines here along Brock Road. Brock Road is the main north-south road in this area. It becomes very prominent during the 1864 Overland Campaign, Wilderness and Spotsylvania battles, because it's the main north-south road. So Jackson may be considering, okay, we're crossing the Rappahannock River. If we're doing it here to the west, their target may well be the Brock Road to move further south. For Hooker, it wasn't, but we see Jackson potentially considering that it could have been. We see other major landmarks being Chancellorsville, the most prominent centerpiece of this map. We also see Hamilton's Crossing here, because again, this is where we know, certainly by the time this map was made at any point during the campaign, this is where we know Union forces have crossed as of April 29th. So we see the big spot, and we also see these little marks to say, perhaps to say, there are Union and Confederate forces engaged already down here near Hamilton's Crossing. But then we also see Union and Confederate positions as the campaign begins. So no later than 11 a.m. on May 1st is where we begin to see these markings. We see crossing points, or one of the crossing points is Union Army, marked out with these two X's. Again, both of the points on the river. We also see the Confederate positions, which I think is one of the most critical pieces of this entire map, is our first Confederate positions are here in Fredericksburg, here at Hamilton's Crossing, and all in between. And then we see, as Lee and Jackson begin to respond to Hooker's threat, again coming in from the west and sweeping this way, they begin to come up these two main roads. So this marking could be Zoan Church, could be Salem Church, but either way, major landmarks, targets for the Confederates as they come out of Fredericksburg, and the other is Tabernacle Church. And these are the two sites that the Confederates set up their defensive points at on the morning of May 1st. And we see that these main pieces are all here for the morning of May 1st. So we're looking most likely, I would say, at a time frame between evening of April 30th to midday, May 1st. And we also see Stonewall Jackson asking a really big picture question of what is the Union Army going for? And that, I think, is why we have the Brock Road marked so prominently. So he is thinking strategically, what might be our concerns? We see landmarks that are missing that would be present later in the battle. So we don't see Union lines laid out here around Chancellorsville at all. We do not see a right flank. And all of these roads that Jackson spent, the last 20 minutes we've been talking, that Jackson spent all of that time asking questions about, sending people out to look for in between their position down this map, which is a little skewed to be like right about here, to get back toward the Brock Road, to get back toward the Turnpike. And all of these roads are missing, which again gives us a few potential conclusions here. My favorite, as you can probably tell, is that this was a map used early in the battle. Jackson's, as we would call it, Jackson's first flank attack, which is when he responds quickly coming out of Fredericksburg, and then he does lead a small flank attack up here along the Turnpike. Very, very small in comparison, but used early on in the battle in terms of the Confederate response, understanding the Union crossing points, and understanding their concentration points. One, to see it laid out in the geography of where do I need to respond? Where do we need to move Confederate troops to get them in place for defensive or offensive purposes? Possibly used for a base reference throughout the battle. But again, we see no markings from later on. There's also the question of when does this map make its way into Robert E. Lee's hands? Is this a token that gets back to him later? Is it something that's sent back to him during the battle? Did Jackson send it back even as early as soon as he arrives on the battlefield on May 1st after to say, here's the situation. We've got troops here and here. We know the Union Army crossed here, and this is our line for now. We really don't know. Lee pastes it into the book, but again, we don't know how it came to be. Hopefully, you're a little less confused than when we started, but we also don't know exactly when it was used. But you've probably noticed that this route has led us to almost more questions than answers just by looking a little more deeply at this one artifact. But I'm going to say we've got that set of questions, right? What can this tell us about the battle? What can this tell us about Jackson? And I'm going to add in one other set of questions just for fun, because while we've been considering the map, we can't consider it purely in isolation, because again, this comes as a package deal. This is all part of the same biography of Stonewall Jackson. that we've been looking at. This is all part of the memento that Robert E. Lee crafted. So then my next question is to ask, what can this tell us about the memories that we have of Lee and Jackson and that Lee had of Jackson? So this is really a memento about Stonewall Jackson, right? That Robert E. Lee crafts. These men had a strong bond. That's part of what rises that Cracker Box meeting to such prominence, is that we see the brilliance of their attack at Chancellorsville. We see the kind of masterminded tactics that as a team that they could bring to the table. And so we see Chancellorsville in many ways as a pinnacle of their partnership. And I think Lee perhaps saw it the same way. And perhaps that's why he decided to paste that particular map that he had of Jackson's into his biography. For Jackson, his trust of Lee was immense. He says, Lee is the only man I know whom I would follow blindfolded. And so we see, this is, by the way, the signature that Lee had pasted into this book as well, respectfully, T.J. Jackson. For Robert E. Lee, he said of Stonewall Jackson, I am grateful to Almighty God for having given us such a man. And he said also, such an executive officer the sun never shone on. So you see again the bond between these two men. And then we see, again, that Robert E. Lee had also signed this book. And we have this other quote from Robert E. Lee about Stonewall Jackson and what happens, or how he's feeling after Jackson's death. So of course, Jackson was wounded after his flank attack on May 2nd, dies of pneumonia on May 10th. So this is also not only the pinnacle of their partnership, but the last time, the last battle that these men worked together on. So for Lee, he said, but while we mourn his death, we feel that his spirit still lives and will inspire the whole army with its indomitable courage and unshaken confidence in God as our hope and our strength. So he's crafting a physical reminder or physical remembrance of Jackson's last battle. He said in the aftermath of Jackson's wounding, he has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. Which is a quote repeated endlessly. But if we really think about the sentiment behind that, you see in Robert E. Lee the loss of an officer that he trusted, somebody that he really could rely on to execute a vision, as he did at Chancellorsville. So Lee, as he sent a message for the Army of Northern Virginia on May 11th, 1863, the day after Jackson's death, he wrote, the daring skill and energy of this great and good soldier, by the decree of an all-wise providence, are now lost to us. And then he continued with this quote. So we see the ways that Lee, so we talked a lot about how Jackson is interacting with his map, but we're also now seeing the ways that Lee is interacting with the map and actively crafting this memento, rather than it just being a very passive possession. And then I think it is also a possession that speaks to our memory of both of these folks. So again, we talk about how this map was originally identified as almost certainly being used at the Cracker Box meeting, even though now I'm hoping you all have some doubts about that conclusion. A photocopy of this map was first given to the park in some of its earliest days as they recognized the map's importance. So that's back in 1932. A few years after that, Philadelphian Roland Taylor donated the entire thing, the whole book, to the park. He was a friend of the park, but in January 1940, he actually donates more than a photocopy, but donates the actual thing. The conversation had begun in June of 1939, and he was asking about conditions in the museum at the park, just wanted to make sure that the book would be safe. Now, he was already connected to the park. He was good friends with one of the main preservationists who helped to donate a lot of the land, to purchase a lot of the land at Spotsylvania Courthouse and then donate it to the park. And Taylor himself had bought the map at an auction in Philadelphia for $750. He bought this book. Right, just let that sink in for a minute. $750 for this entire package. But even at that time, it was connected to the Cracker Box meeting as possibly consulting the map now pasted in the old book. So there's such a draw to that sort of famous dramatic scene for us as well, and has been for some time. You know, this is not just us today, but it's us even in the 1930s and 40s, where we see the allure of associating this map with what we would see as the pinnacle of their relationship. This was its spot in the exhibits. Now, these are exhibits from the 1960s that were replaced in 2014. But for many years, you see Conference in the Pines. You see that painting of the last meeting of Lee and Jackson, and you see the sketch of their cracker box meeting, and then you would have seen the map, likely consulted during the cracker box meeting. And it really was, again, as recently as 2013, that it would have been placed in this very case. Frequently, we would take it out for special occasions, even though it was on permanent display. But even today, when it's placed on temporary display, and usually that's in the month of May, if you go to the Chancellorsville Battlefield, you'll see it in the exhibits as being out for the month of the anniversary of the battle. You will see it grouped with artifacts associated with bivouac. And part of the problem is we were planning these exhibits before anyone tasked me with the temporary exhibit, when I started to say, wait a minute, guys, what do we know about this map? And the poor entire staff, when I started asking around and saying, well, haven't you looked at it? And they're like, well, no, actually, I haven't really looked at it. And once you really look at it, you start to see, oh no, the story might just be unraveling. But again, that brings us back to some of the bigger questions. How did we collectively come to read this story backwards onto the map? And why do we read history backwards sometimes? I think a lot of times it's because for our purposes, we often see history as a place of inspiration. We see it as a place where we want to see compelling stories. We want to learn more about individuals who are meaningful to us today. And so we see artifacts as connections with these people. And we see, as we're looking for something of a usable past, we look at these things as something that can connect us. The details of the story maybe diminish a little bit. But I like to think that there's a great joy in taking a closer look. This is one of our volunteers who helped me to put the book out on display for a temporary display in 2013. And I just love, I mean, this made my volunteer's life. Like, I believe that Britt, I'm not sure he'd smiled that big on his wedding day. No offense to Cindy, his wife, but we definitely made his life by letting him hold this book, which I think tells us a lot. And I also promise you that anytime I'm holding it, I'm also smiling like that. So I think it tells us a lot about the ways that we interact with the past as well. You know, what does the book tell us about our memories of Lee and Jackson? The park still views this book and this map as a crown jewel of the park's collection because it has such an association with these two prominent individuals. And it tells us, I think, a lot about the kind of power that these symbols, whether it be the map, the signatures contained inside the book, or any other representations of these men, Jackson's last fight, Jackson's last march, the bond between those leaders, you know, these symbols still have a lot of power for us today. I think our forebears have crafted a narrative of Jackson as a hero, and this map as being a participant in one of his greatest moments. We've long wanted to believe that story. And, you know, we have no definitive conclusions. You can still believe that story if you care to. But I think it's important also to think about, again, what does that story say about us when we start to look back on it and we look back at this artifact. So with that, I'm going to thank you all so much again for coming out here, for navigating what was most likely a confusing series of maps and quotations, and oh my goodness, what was known when, but helping us to kind of uncover and dig a little deeper into what we may or may not know about this really prominent artifact, and to hopefully do a little bit of self-reflection and introspection as well about how we remember the past, how we look at artifacts, how we consider figures from the past as well. So thank you again, and more than happy to take questions. Thank you. Questions, opinions, thoughts, all welcome. Go for it.
Do we know what happened to Jedediah Hotchkiss's maps?
So I know that some of Hotchkiss's maps are collected. There's a really great book called Make Me a Map of the Valley, which many of you are probably familiar with, that includes a believe it's Hotchkiss's diaries, although I haven't looked at it for a long time. It could be his
Yes.
letters, diaries. Got it, thanks. There's also published versions of his letters, I think, unless I got that from the collection. I'll have to consult my files, but if you look in those books, there are copies of some of his maps, and they become the base for, I think, many of the, certainly the reports that Jackson writes. So could be used in the official records. I have to check on that.
Including the chancellor's will.
So there is there's a very pretty map that Hotchkiss made of Chancellorsville that I believe is in Making a Map of the Valley, but I'll have to double check on that one. But yes, there is like the finished Hotchkiss map. But what I'm really curious about is like all those little sketches, those one-offs that he was doing, then quickly handing to division commanders. So not the pretty one that he caught up on later as they were doing their final reports, which I think is the version that I've seen published. So, great question. Oh, thanks. Yes.
Admittedly, I know very little about the whole Chancellorsville Fredericksburg thing, but in part of your comments, you mentioned something about the brilliant maneuver of the Jackson Lee response. And I'm not getting that. My
Yeah.
novice impression, okay, so the Union is sweeping down to the northwest, and these guys are looking for the roads to go and meet that. Where's the military brilliance in this?
All right. So, and I forgot to do this for the last one, but for the Zoomers out there, the question was, where's the military brilliance? And thank you so much for asking. People never ask me that question, and I love it. So I think historians typically toss out the word brilliance for this because it worked. One of the things that we are usually towing the line while we're talking at Chancellorsville is talking about, there is that fine line between like military brilliance and complete disaster. And Lee and Jackson were walking that line. It's only brilliant because it worked. And even then, if this were a presentation about the fighting at Chancellorsville on May 3rd, I would then be telling you that Jackson set up Robert E. Lee for a complete disaster of a morning on May 3rd because his attack didn't accomplish all that he hoped it would. But I believe that the idea of sending the entire 11th Corps running, which if we just back up, oops, too far. There we go. So essentially, when we're looking at Jackson's attack, this is Jackson's attack lining up, and he's able to sweep all the way to about here on the evening of May 2nd. So, in terms of ground cover, in terms of sending an entire corps running for their lives, wildly successful, right? But there's also huge risks with this maneuver, which I think is where we start to get into are you sure it's brilliance? Because that short answer is no. But the longer answer is, they did layer in some things, some pieces of knowledge that helps them to make this not just reckless. So one of them is, they knew that Hooker had pulled his men back and had dug in. This is a small incursion of Tim Sickles wanting to attack the portion of Jackson's attack Jackson's march that he saw, but initially his line was right here. So they're looking at the evidence and they see that, Hooker's dug in. That suggests defensive posture. That's how he wants to fight his battles on the defensive. And then you also have these 14,000 men left behind with Lee, and they spend the entire day going back and forth across this expanse of ground, basically leading probing attacks. So it is to the point that the soldiers who are fighting through here believe that they are repulsing determined attacks of the enemy, whereas the soldiers down here, their entire goal is just to be a distraction, so that Hooker thinks that his goal is accomplished. You pull back into a defensive posture in order to be attacked. He's getting attacked here. He thinks everything is going fine. There are some reports of troops over here. They're not heated particularly well. And so this comes as largely a complete surprise to the Union forces. So brilliance, though, still in the balance, right? And it's something that I think is worth a long conversation about, more time than I perhaps have right now for everyone else's patience, but it's hard to say, there's no clear cut answer to say that this was the right thing, except again, that it worked in this moment. But again, ask me again on May 3rd, and I'll tell you it might not have been a great decision. But then again, also, what other options do you have? Because as much as Hooker is criticized for pulling back into a defensive position, Lee and Jackson don't have a lot of options once a strong defensive line is established in their front. And for as much as that helps. Yeah, go for it.
I noticed the signature, Lee's signature is dated May 3rd, 1867. Of course, May 3rd is the day after Jackson is shot and the day that the climax of the battle occurs. Do you think that's coincidental that he signed it on May 3rd, 1867, or did it have a bigger meaning for him?
Yeah, so for a lot of reasons, I don't really believe in coincidences, but I don't know. I haven't found any evidence of like a ceremonial presentation on that date, if that's the day that he received it. The book is published in 1866. I have thought it's interesting that he doesn't sign it until 1867, but it could be that he was waiting for the anniversary to come around to sign it that day. It could be that it was presented to him that day, and he signed it on that date. The short answer is I don't know, but I would guess that it isn't just happenstance, because I don't think Robert E. Lee is going to forget May 3rd, 1863 anytime soon. Yes.
On the left side of the book, it says it's the first off the press, but it has the date of 1863, which is inconsistent with it being published later.
Whoops.
Do you want to repeat the question for the Zoom?
Yes, thank you. For the Zoom folks, it says, yeah, that's actually a good question. The question was that the book says it's 1863, and I said the book was published in 1866. That just makes me think I wrote the date wrong in my notes, and it was probably published in 1863. But I see someone else shaking their head. Does anyone else know more about this? My guess is you're right. It was probably published in 1863, capitalizing, which also makes sense in my memory now, that it was capitalizing off of Jackson's recent passing. Oh, you mean like the small fine print? What does it say? It is a quote from Lee to Jackson at Chancellorsville. I have just received your note informing me that you were wounded. I cannot express my regret at the occurrence. Could I have directed events I should have chosen for the good of the country to have been disabled in your stead? I congratulate you on the victory, which is due to your skill and energy. So it's what Lee wrote to Jackson while Jackson was attempting to recover from his wounds.
Anyone else with a question? Nobody else. Okay. Yes,
I have
one.
Yeah.
On Jackson's map, where was Catherine's furnace located? It wasn't laid out, but it seems to be prominent on those other maps.
Okay, so the question was on Jackson's map, where is Catherine Furnace? Because it seems to be very prominent on the other maps. And you're right, which I can think again, I'm just gonna use it as a plug again to say this is perhaps an early battle map, because we're here at Chancellorsville, again, the scale is a little wonky, but I would say Catherine Furnace right about here in relation to Chancellorsville and the Rock Road. Now again, the scale's not perfect. It's gonna be right around in this area. But certainly, as well, by the evening of May 1st, because they're meeting on the road that leads to Catherine Furnace, Jackson would have been very well aware of at least that road and that landmark by that evening.
Okay, thank you.